Yay! Welcome back, everyone.
We're back. Do I have snacks in my teeth? I don't, do I? That would be very unprofessional. Welcome back to the virtual Azure Community Day. Before we jump in and talk to our next speaker, I just want to remind everybody that Microsoft is supporting this for us, which is lovely of them. And we would love you, if you're into Azure, you're into Microsoft dev-based content, jump on the Microsoft Source newsletter. You'll get a mix of global and localized content. You can sign up for that at aka.ms/microsoft.source. Did I get that right, Flor?
You did. Perfect.
I did. Whew, go me.
Nailed it.
We're on to our next speaker. Adrienne Tacke is going to talk to us about containers and you, and like containers, man, buzzword of the moment. Everyone I talk to is all about containers. One of the things I'm all about, though, is suites. We had a bit of a chat before we jumped on the air, and I was like, is there anything in particular that I should mention? And she was like, I spend way too much money on dessert. And playing Borderlands, I think, was the other thing. But the dessert thing resonated with me, and Flora and I were both like, there's no such thing as too much dessert. That's an outrageous statement to make. But we're going to park the dessert for just a moment so we can jump in and talk about moving towards container-based approaches on Azure and what that looks like for people. So I will now hand over to you, Dessert Queen, to run us through some container goodness.
Sweet. Thanks so much. Hello, everyone. Kumusta? My name is Adrienne Tacke. I'm a Filipino software engineer based in Las Vegas, and I'm so happy that you're all here with me tonight. For me, it's nighttime, but thank you for joining us today. I'm really excited to talk to you about what the heck containers are and what Azure offers in terms of container services. So let's get started here. Let me share my slides. All right, so we're going to talk about containers, specifically containers and you. Hopefully you are here because you've heard about the buzzword or just want to get started with how to use them in Azure. Maybe you've seen them before, and we want to just clarify what offerings Azure has and how you may use them in your own software development workflow. So before containers, and let's move this out of the way as well. Before containers, there were a number of issues dealing with software development. And when it came to developing, there were three particular tricky issues that we would come across as we started to create more complex applications, more broad applications, or worked on applications that spread across teams. So the first thing is multiple target environments. It's so much of a trope that it's almost a de facto programmer joke, right? It only works on my machine. And this has happened in so many different scenarios. This can be because, it's working everywhere but production, of course, or it's working on that person's machine but not yours. Maybe even it's working on your work machine but not your own personal machine. Or how about the scenario when maybe you start a new job or some new hires are coming onto your team and you try to get them set up with your platform so they can start developing and helping and debugging or writing features. Well, it's the same situation. We always run into issues of little configurations here or subtle changes in environments there that just make it almost a headache for us to deal with. And that's something that is a real problem that we still deal with today. Tricky issue number two, alluding to that, is configuration. So our applications are getting way more complex, and there are so many different things that they use that it's okay to have it use different sorts of configurations. That's the whole reason why our applications can be extended. Maybe we want to use a different set of configurations for particular environments, or maybe we have a different set for particular regions. However you want to split your application and configure them, we run into this issue of having many configurations. And sometimes applications just need to be that picky, but that does cause some issues when it comes to deploying to multiple environments and configuring them so that they work for everyone. Lastly, this kind of led to the tricky issue number 3. So as we started going through this and as we started configuring more and more and turning all these knobs and switches, we tried to work around that as devs by possibly creating scripts that would kind of help us for that. And I feel like this is the beginnings of what we are about to talk about, which are containers, but not quite there yet. Some of the hacky workarounds that I've seen are adding all of these things, and we would start to add them to our source control, and that was okay for a moment, but again, as they got more complex and as there were more configurations that we needed to set, those configuration scripts could get really, really long, and then they could become really difficult to understand in terms of what actually changed. You have to scroll all the way down here to see one little variable that was changed. That became super, super cumbersome, and it's something that I think that we have tried to resolve with containers. So keeping these 3 issues in mind, we now move into, so what the heck are containers? We've heard them before. We've heard them in conjunction with other random buzzwords, right? You hear them with Docker and Kubernetes and K8s and AKS, and they're all bundled together. And I know that when I first started learning about this, I was very confused. I'm like, I don't know, it's the same thing. I think they're all the same thing. So I'm hoping that this kind of high-level explanation can at least get us to an understanding of what they are and how we could use them as developers. So of all the definitions that we can find, and in my own research, it's going to vary a little bit, but I think the best definition for a container is this one. It is an independent package of software and its dependencies. So I really tried to break it down, and of course there are way more complex, more concise, more verbose definitions of what a container means, but at the essence, this is how I best remember it and helps me understand it in the context of development much better. Now, when you look at this definition, an independent package of software and its dependencies, let's break that down. What does that mean? We kind of understand independent package, I would hope so, and I'll go into it a little more if you don't. We hopefully all understand what software is, so what could dependencies be? Well, dependencies look like, first of all, our actual code, right? Without that, nothing else would work. But then it also includes things like our runtime, our system libraries, and those pesky configuration files or any other configuration settings that we may need. So these are the dependencies. These are all the things that we need for our software or our application to run. And now when we do have all of these dependencies, we package them. We put them together in this independent thing that can be used anywhere. And what's so great about this is that it doesn't care. Well, get my mouse under control here. What's great about an independent package here is that it doesn't care what host that it's deployed onto. We no longer have to worry about what kind of environment we're deploying it onto because we gave it the instructions to build the environment that it needs. It's self-sustaining, it's independent, it knows how to get what it needs in order to create itself. And so this is a solution to hopefully solve some of those issues of it doesn't work on my machine. Well, again, it doesn't matter because we've given it the instructions to create whatever it needs to work on that machine. And we no longer have those subtle environmental differences pretty much ruining our deployments or ruining, anything else that we tried to deploy. So that's great. So you're like, this is awesome, Adrienne. I want to start using containers right now. How do we use it? How do we use it in Azure? And that's great. And I'll tell you, as of now, there are 4 things that we can use with Azure. And those are these 4. So the first thing is the Azure Container Registry. And then the next two, which I've grouped together because they are similar in what they do and what we intend to use them for, are Azure Container Instances and Azure Web Apps for containers. And finally, there is the Azure Kubernetes service. And we'll talk about what these four are, what they do, what they don't do, how they work with each other, and hopefully you'll get a better understanding of what it is you would need to use. So, first thing, Azure Container Registry. So, just like we can version control our code, and just like we can distribute our source code, we can do the same thing with what's called images. Now, images are what go into the container, and they make up these instructions that build up the environment of what our software needs. So just as we use our repos to store our source code, we use Azure Container Registries to store and distribute those images in the same way. Now, this is a private managed registry service, and if you've ever used Docker Hub, which is this open source public place where you can get base images or official images, you'll know that this is the public version of where you can get all of these images. Now, the Azure Container Registry is more analogous to their private offerings. So it's the same thing. You store and distribute images there, but it's now private, and maybe you use it for your own team. It is based on the open source Docker Registry 2.0, and what that means is that you can now have Docker compatible images, and you can also host any OCI or Open Container Initiative images or artifacts in your Azure Container Registry. So this wants to be your one-stop shop for all your OCI compliant build artifacts. And what this means is that you just have a broader range of what you can support with your application, and most of what you would be using and collaborating on are base images, either from official companies or ones that you host yourself. And so with all things in Azure, they come in different tiers, and Azure Container Registry is no different, right? So here we have 3 tiers. There's the basic tier, which is what we'll use today in my demo. And this is great for, again, prototyping. You want to get up and running really quickly. You want a small demo or a small project. That's what the basic tier is great for. The standard tier is more likely what most teams will use. It's something that if you have maybe several containers in play, or you're starting to think about moving towards a container-based approach, standard is most likely where you'll stay. And finally, there is the premium tier. Now, premium is probably best for those teams who are already pretty much fully invested in the container approach. And I say that because there are a lot of extras that you would not get the benefit from unless you are already fully on this container-based approach. Some of those things include, it being the one with 500 webhooks that you can use. It's the only one that has the highest throughput for Docker pulls. So some of these base images are really, really large. And if you constantly deal with all of these images, you're going to need a higher throughput to be able to pull and push these images faster without being bottlenecked. And finally, Premium is the only one that has geo-replication supported. So if that is something that you need and you use containers often, again, this is probably what your team would be using. Those on the fully invested container-based approach are probably going to be on the Premium tier. And likewise, just like most things in Azure, there are several different ways to deal with the container registry, as with most of the resources that you can create in Azure. So you can use the Azure CLI, the portal, or the API to manage your container registries. And so after now that we know that what this is, knowing that this is pretty analogous to our repos for our source code, it works the same way in terms of a container development workflow. You can integrate container registries into your workflow, just like we integrate our repos into our own continuous integration and continuous deployment workflows. So the repos would be the target for that, right? And our container development workflows would use the container registry as the target for those kinds of workflows. And lastly, again, same kind of analogy and same functionality that is parallel to how we distribute and work with source code is just like we can automate all of these CI and CD tasks. You can do the same thing with the Azure Container Registry with things called ACR tasks. So a very common one is to have an image be rebuilt automatically if the base image that you're using changes. So that's the Azure Container Registry, right? This is our repo of where we would store and distribute the images that we are using as part of our application. And I want to show a quick demo on how to create one very quickly using the Azure CLI. So let me switch over here really quick. Let's get this up. All right, so I have my repo here. Let me increase that a little bit just in case. Sweet. All right, so the first thing we want to do is log in using the Azure login command. Now, this may redirect me really quickly, and it will. So let's just sign in. Sweet, I've logged in successfully. Oh, you get a sneak peek of my demo here. Sweet, so I've logged in successfully here. Now, the next thing that we want to do after logging in is to create a resource group, specifically for my container registry. And it's kind of a good idea to dedicate a single resource group to this container registry, and you'll see why later on. But really, what we do this for is to lower the risk of accidentally deleting any container images that we have in a registry if we, for some reason, combined it with our Azure container instances or something else. So we want to keep the container registry separate. So let's do that. Let's create a separate group for it. And we'll use the AZ group create command. And now with this, we have to pass in a couple parameters. So we're going to pass in the location. And since I'm in the West Coast, I'm going to use the US2 location. We need to give it a name. So I'm going to do the VACD demo group. Let's do that for now. That'll be the name of the resource group. And then we're going to assign the subscription that we want to do this with. So I can hear something there. Maybe it's not muted. 1 second. So we'll pass in the subscription that we want to deploy this on. And that for me, that's going to be Camusta Demos. So give this a moment to create, and we'll see that's succeeded. Awesome. So now we've created the resource group. Now let's just go ahead and create the actual Azure container registry. So in the same fashion, we will use the ACR, which is Azure Container Registry, create command. And with this, we'll now pass in a few parameters for that. So first, it needs the resource group. And for that will be the one we just created. So the name for there is VACD demo group. Next, we need to give our registry a name. So we'll do VACD demo registry to keep some consistency there. And then finally, we choose the tier that we want. And like I said earlier, we'll just be using the basic tier since this is just going to be a short running demo. So we'll give that a moment to create. And awesome. So it has succeeded. So at this point, we're going to get a long object here, JSON object, with a bunch of different things here. But what we want to keep track of is this right here, the login server. We'll want to get this. I'm going to copy this because we will be needing it for a couple of the other steps that we'll be doing later on. So let me just paste this really quick. All right, so now I have it, and I will be able to reference it when I need it. So let's give some more space here. Let's just double check and see that this has created. We saw that it was successful, but I don't know, I need to always double check that it actually created. So we will do list, and then we'll make it pretty by having the table or the output be a table. And sweet, we see it right here. So this is our registry that we've created. It's under the correct resource group and all the other parameters that we set in. Awesome, so now we know it's there. So back to our slides here. What I wanted to say now is, now that we have a registry, well, let's now also treat you to another demo and actually push an image to that brand new registry that we just created. And I don't know if this is just me, but anytime I hear the word or command push in anything technical, I always think of salt and pepper. So we're gonna leave that there, encouraging me, and I'm gonna go ahead and push an image that I have, right? So the first thing is, before we can do any of that, we now need to first log into our registry before we can do anything. So let's do that. We will use the ACR login command, and we will pass in the name of our registry that we just created. So that is the ACD demo registry. So we're going to log in. Hopefully it's successful. Yes, naming is difficult, but we have logged into our registry. So now what we want to do, for the sake of time, I actually already have some images that I have created, some Docker images. So instead of watching me pull some possibly large images, I'll show you the ones that I have. So I have some already here, that these, some tests here to make sure that we can get through it. And so what we want to do is, I'm going to use this demo image that I've already built. And what we want to do before we do that is we want to tag this image. Now I'm going to tag it with since this is going to be the base image that I'm going to be using in my registry, I want to tag it with a stable tag. And what that means is just, you've seen like version 1 or version 2. Since this is going to be the first version of this base image that I'm going to use for my registry, we will tag it as so. And so let's just put some space here. So we're going to use the Docker tag command, and then now we need to put the name of the image that we want to use. So let me actually, I should have left it there just to double check. I'm going to do Docker tag, and then the name of the image that I want to tag. So that's the demo here. And then now we're going to tag it with the fully qualified name of our registry and the name of the image. So that's why it was a good idea to copy that login server, the fully qualified name, so that we can have that. So let me grab that really quick. Where did I put it? Here it is. So we'll have the fully qualified name of our registry, and then the name of our image, and then the stable tag. So we tag that with a colon and then v1. So that's done. We've tagged it. And if we look at this, you'll see now that we have the tagged version here with the fully qualified name and v1. And now all that's left is to push it. So we are going to push this to our registry. So we're going to have the full name here and the tag. We want to push it using the fully qualified name just as we have had it and tagged it. So we're pushing. Hopefully it's working. It looks like it's working. Sweet. Yay, it's fully pushed, hopefully. And again, like I've mentioned before, I always need to double check that it actually is there. So we can run an ACR repository list command. And we want to give the parameter name of our actual registry. So that is VACD demo registry, and then again, we want to output it to a nice table. Sweet. So there it is. We have just pushed the image to the brand new registry we have just created. Off to a great start. And that was successful. So that's awesome. So at this point now, we have created our container registry. So we have a place to store and distribute the images that we work with. And now we have deployed the image that I had on my machine. That could be an application, that could be a base image that your team is going to use later on. But at this point, we actually don't have, or we don't, where are the actual containers? We haven't actually used them yet. We've only have the image in our registry. So this is where the next two services from Azure come in. Those are the Azure Container Instances, which is what I'll talk about right now, and then the web app for containers, which are more akin to Azure App Services. So if you just need to get up and running, which is what we're doing right now with this demo, Azure Container Instances is your best bet. It is the fully managed hosting environment for your container workloads, which means if you don't want to deal with that overhead and provisioning of other resources, this is the way to go. You don't need to, again, be explicit about provisioning or managing the VMs that you're hosting because this is fully managed for you. You are billed only for the time that you use them, as most of the other managed resources on Azure. And this is not too recent, but before this was a key difference between them. But now Azure Container Instances does support both Windows and Linux containers, and they do it with the same API, which is pretty nice. Now, one of the key differences here with an Azure Container Instance is that if you need to persist state or retrieve any state with your application, you can mount it to an Azure file shares. You can do this with container instances, and that's a pretty big advantage over Azure Web Apps or containers for web apps. And then another really big difference, one of the key differences, is that for Azure Container Instances, you can specify the exact CPU cores and memory. So if you have optimized or you know that the testing that you're doing is only going to be to a certain threshold or extent, this is a very valuable thing. And as we've seen, you're only billed for the time that you use them and also the tier that you're using them at. But if you know that you can specify exactly what you need, you have better control in that way. And again, if I haven't made it clear, this is the fastest and simplest way to run containers in Azure. You literally spin them up. Some of the options in Azure called bursting. They use Azure Container Instances as those bursted workloads. They spin up these whenever they need to do shorter tasks, automation, smaller things are best for the Azure Container Instance. And so now we want to deploy the actual image that we push to our registry that we just created. And let's actually do that. Let's go ahead and deploy it to a container using Azure Container Instance. Let's go back here. And what I love about the Azure CLI is that this demo is quite literally 2 commands. So let's do that. So first, we again have to create a separate group, and I want to create a second group to house the Azure Container Instance. So remember, we want to keep the registry separate. We want it isolated in its own resource group. So let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to do another group. We'll use the create command, and this time we'll name it. So this one will be I am terrible at naming right now. Let's just do vcd. ACI group. And then same thing, we have to pass it the location. So again, I'm going to pass it US2 because that's closest for me. Awesome. And now we, again, as we created our Azure Container Registry, we can use the same create command to create the actual container. And so let's do that. So what we're going to do is use the AZ container create command. I apologize. There are a bunch of other parameters we have to pass here, so I want to make sure I get them right. So we're going to use the AZ container create command, and like I alluded to, there are a couple more parameters we have to use if we want to do this two-step, two-command promise that I made to you. So with this, we have to pass in the resource group. So that's the one that we just created. So that's VACD, ACI, group. Now we need to name our container. So I'm going to do hello VACD demo. Next, we want to specify the actual image we want to use. So we'll do that with the image parameter. And we have to get the fully qualified name again of our registry. So that is VACD demo registry.azurecr.io. That's the fully qualified name. Then the actual name of our image, which is, I already forgot. I think it's VACI. Let's just go ahead and actually check it because I already forgot the name. Yeah. This is when using too many acronyms becomes difficult. So let me paste that really quick. So let's just start this over. So it's container. We want to create one. We need the resource group. So that is the VACD ACI group. Let me move this up so we can see. We need the name of the container, so I named it hello VACD demo. We want the image name, so we're going to paste, oh, that was the name of the image, and then the fully qualified name of our registry, right? So that's VACD demo registry.azurecr.io, and then the fully qualified name includes the tag. And now we need to expose it to the internet. So we're going to give it a friendly name here using the DNS name label. And for now, I'm just going to call it hello VACD. Promise there's 2 more parameters. And then we need to expose the ports. So we're going to do ports, this is a default 80. And now we're going to pass in some credentials. So let me get that really quick. I want to do that off screen. Let's double check this. Resource groups. And we want this one. Now what I'm doing is I'm getting the credentials from the container registry because we will need them for this command. So going into my registry here. Sweet, so I've got the password that I needed. So the final 2 are the registry username and password. So we'll pass in registry username, and for here, the username is just the name of the registry. And so we'll start that. That way I don't have to paste my password in full view. We'll put that password there. And at this moment, it should run and create the container once it is doing that. And it seems to be working. So right now it's creating that container. It's building the image that I have pushed up there. And we should be able to view this simple image that I have here. And if it works out, we'll see a very happy GIF of coming from an Azure container instance. So let's give that a little moment. Sweet, it has created it and it's running. And so now we have the fully qualified name here. So if we copy this and head back, open up. Awesome. ¿Cómo está? And I'm super happy, just like this guy. So I searched for Filipino GIFs, and apparently this is the first one that comes up. But I think it works out because this was my reaction when I got it to work. So, and this is also kind of my reaction now that it's working live. So, so we are here now. We have deployed this image, and this image is pretty simple. We know we just have a title and a GIF here. This could be your application, and this has been deployed into a container on Azure Container Instances. So that's where it's running from right now, and it's pretty sweet. So within those few commands, we've already created our own Azure container registry. We've pushed an image to that registry, and we've now deployed that image to an Azure container instance. So now I want to talk to you about what the Azure Web App for containers is. I always mix up those, so I was referring to it earlier as Web App for containers. But essentially, this is the Azure App Service version of containers, or a container service. So we are now going to go through some of the differences of why you would want to use this one over Azure Container Instances. So as you can kind of guess, because they are more analogous to the Azure App Service, these are better for longer running applications. If you actually have fuller applications, not just a small demo like mine, or you don't have you don't want to use task automation or jobs, you would probably want to use Azure Web Apps for containers to contain your longer running applications. And again, because they are analogous to the Azure App Service, you can take advantage of the Azure App Service features that you already know and love in regular software development that are not in containers. So they are also the typical app service plans that you are used to, which are different from the Azure Container Services or instances. And with this, you have a little bit more control. So because Azure Container Instances are fully managed, you don't have as much control over the resources that you are provisioning, right? You let go of that and you let Azure handle that. Now, with Azure Web App for containers, that's a little bit of the opposite. You can actually deploy with maybe subtle differences in your dependencies or your runtime or your libraries, and you have control over that. And again, with the app service features, that means you also have access to the monitoring and diagnostic tools, which you do not have on Azure Container Instances. Again, because you know they're fully managed, you don't have access to that. You kind of offload that. But if you do require this, or you already have a couple applications in containers and need to debug, these become very, very useful and probably the better place for you to deploy your applications to and containers to. And lastly, if you want to start really fully adopting the container-based approach, maybe you want to have always on or dedicated environments for developing with containers. Again, Azure Container Instances are not the place for that. They're for quick things. They're for short-lived things. And so akin to having longer running applications, environments fall within that, right? And so if you want to start moving to that and want dedicated environments like that, having containers with Azure Web App for containers is probably your best bet. So those are the two places that you can have containers kind of a little bit easier when you're first starting out. But now we get to the one that is like almost synonymous, confused, misappropriated with containers in general, and that's because it has the word Kubernetes in it, right? So what actually is Azure Kubernetes Service? Well, it is a managed Kubernetes hosting environment. So what this means is that let's say you have multiple containers, or you're already on a fully container-based approach. You may have more than one container that you're running. You may have hundreds of containers. That gets really, really tricky to orchestrate yourself. You don't want a dedicated, you don't want to dedicate your developers to managing all of that, because that's its own environment and ecosystem that needs to be configured. So using something like Azure Kubernetes Service kind of takes care of that for you, but it's still some things that you need to configure. So like I said, multiple containers or services. Now this gives you the greatest control on how you scale. So this is where you start getting into things like pods, and depending on what your scale looks like, you can automatically scale to a certain number of pods when certain conditions are met, automatically scale down when those things are no longer there or the demand is not there. These are the kinds of really fine-grained controls that you would have with something like Azure Kubernetes Service, and really only make sense if you are working with more than one container, maybe more than a few containers, really. You can handle it on your own, but it is really a numbers game. So the more that you have, the more benefit something like Azure Kubernetes Service would give you and your team if you are working with a lot of containers. Which brings me to that point, container orchestration. So managing all of this, having service discovery across containers, if you're using multiple in that way, these are the types of things that you'll have access to and have greater control over using Azure Kubernetes Service. And just as a fun fact, they actually do use Azure VMs under the hood. And here in this instance, because of that, that means you do pay for the VM instances, the storage, the networking resources that are consumed by your clusters. So, the greater control that you have, the more you do have to pay attention to, because if configured improperly, they can get very, very costly. But in the end, if you do dedicate your team to a container-based approach or fully move on to all containers, it is the most flexible and the most future-proof way to manage containers in the long run. So naturally, the question does come up, well, which one do I use? And I have taken it upon myself to kind of write this table out as kind of like a quick check to say, if it falls under one of these things, if it has one of these characteristics, it's probably better to use one over the other. And let's go through those. So to start, these are usually always the ones that people ask, well, they sound kind of similar. Which one do I use? And they're usually the first start when you start using containers in Azure. So for Azure Container Instances, these ones are the ones that are ready to use. These are ones that are meant for smaller applications. Again, this task automation, if you have some jobs that you want to run infrequently, they are short-lived, they're on demand, the burst type scenarios. If you just need them really quickly and only for a short time, Azure Container Instances is to go. This demo is a great example. I'm only probably going to use this by the time that I'm done giving this presentation. I won't need this anymore, and that's exactly what Azure Container Instances are built for. Another thing to consider is that if you only need a high level of operation management, meaning you don't need to get into the diagnostics, you don't need to debug what's happening on the resources that are hosting it, you don't need that control, you just want to kind of offload all of that to Azure, Azure Container Instances is your best bet because it is the fully managed service. And if you only have a few containers to deploy or services or one, or you're just trying it out, Azure Container Instances are the best bet for you. Now, to contrast that, you would use Azure Web Apps for teams who are already familiar with the Azure App Services. If you have longer running web apps or things that need to stay on much longer than any of the short-lived burst scenarios, Azure Web Apps for Containers is probably what would benefit you more. If you need those monitoring and diagnostic tools, which you probably will if you have your full applications running in a container, these are things that you would probably like to have and need to have if you want to maintain your application. And again, this is still something that counts for both. So if you only have one or a few containers or services that you want to deploy, this is still a good choice. But you want to consider some of the other things, as that single requirement that's the same on both of them doesn't mean both are good for all scenarios. And lastly, if you have low-cost environments that can take advantage of the free tiers that are available on the familiar app service plans, then you might as well do so. We do have that basic tier for the Azure Container instances, but it's always better if you can take advantage of the free tiers on the Azure Web App for containers, because you get a little bit more with that. Finally, if you're considering, okay, maybe these are not for me, maybe I need to get onto Azure Kubernetes Service, well, this is really for, first of all, if you even want to consider this, the first thing I would highly advise is you should already have a team that has working knowledge of Kubernetes. If you think moving to this because it's the thing and it's the buzzword and it's going to solve all of your problems, you're going to have a lot more problems trying to get your team to not only understand how it actually works, but to really utilize it to its full potential. So you should only be considering this if you already have a good working knowledge of how Kubernetes works. You should also only consider this if you already are or are going to be fully invested in the container-based approach. Again, if you have multiple containers, many containers, this is where the value of Azure Kubernetes Service comes in, because it's the one that will help you orchestrate all of those containers. And usually, if you are a team that is fully invested or have many containers, then you will have a use for this. And again, if by virtue of having so many containers, you may need some orchestration for those workloads. And that's exactly what Azure Kubernetes Service offers you. And lastly, what a big benefit is to many teams when they consider this is that it's a way to keep your infrastructure portable. So let's say for whatever reason you don't like Azure anymore, or you need like a hybrid model where maybe you need to use some AWS, or you want to port it over fully to Google Cloud. It keeps you agnostic and it keeps you able to do that by being compatible with the other cloud providers. And so, in a nutshell, those are all the Azure Container Services and now you are hopefully better acquainted with all of them and how you would use them in your own software development workflow. So thank you, maraming salamat so much. If you have any questions at all, feel free to tweet at me on my handle here. Or Instagram or GitHub. I am putting all of my sample demos, at least the commands, into a repo. So if you wanted to take that and spin it up on your own, I'll be sharing that shortly on my Twitter. So follow me if you want to see that. But thank you. Thank you for taking the time to listen to me. That's all I have.
Thank you, Adrienne. And if you can share it in the live chat as well, that would be awesome so people can check it out right away.
Yeah.
We'll do that.
Cool. There were a couple of questions that popped up while you were chatting. The first one was, if people want to sort of start to get an initial, like a beginner's understanding of the different management techniques you've described, do you have any good recommendations for places they should go, resources they should look at, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. So I was completely overwhelmed with this. Again, I think for me, what helped was starting with Docker. So there's a great site. I can dig up the link and I can post it to the chat after this, but it essentially walks you through what are Docker images, how do you deal with them locally, how do you build them, what are they? And I think getting that understanding first really helped me before I moved into the actual services, because the services deal with all of the images that you're going to be using. So if you don't have that understanding first, I think it becomes a little bit more overwhelming. So I would say learn what Docker is and maybe create your own image first, get comfortable with those commands, and then maybe move on to either deploying on an Azure container instance, which I think is the best way to play around with it and get comfortable with juxtaposing building software with containers to just building software in general. And then you can advance to some of the other things like Azure Web Apps. And then I would leave Kubernetes, Azure Kubernetes Service for last. Like if you don't need to use it or you don't have a need for it, just stay away because you're just going to get overwhelmed. So that's the best advice.
Everybody I talk to is trying to Kubernetes all the things.
Yeah.
So I think that's good advice. Now that we're on Kubernetes, there was quite a deep question in the chat, which was, which AKS ingress controller would you recommend if you are using API management fronted AKS? You are perfectly welcome to say I don't have an answer to that off the top of my head, but if you do...
I do not. I would love to answer that once I actually reread the question again, but I don't have an answer off the top of my head, so...
That's cool.
That's fair.
Quite a deep one.
Yeah.
Any questions from you, Flo?
Nope, absolutely not. Really enjoyed your session. Thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
Fantastic.
Thanks for having me. It was fun to be here.
It was a real zero to hero type talk. I loved it a lot. Yeah, very cool.
Appreciate it. Thank you. So,
Thank you.
大家好
Kamusta?
Servus. Hi.
Hi.
Bonjour.
Jasas.
Hi.
Hoi. Ik ben
I'm
Floor
Ryan Stopping from Austria.
日本からこんにちは。私は不破孝之です。
Ciao, sono Stefano Tempesta, dall'Australia.
Hallo, ik ben Albert Schot uit Nederland.
Hi, I'm Maarten Goed from the Netherlands.
Hi, kamusta? I'm Ruby Jane Cabagna from the Philippines.
Hola.
Hello. Hey there.
Hola, soy Sebastián Pérez de Argentina.
你好，
Desde
我是
España.
胡浩，来自中国上海。
Hi, I'm Sarah Lane from Scotland.
Bonjour, I'm Charlotte from France.
Hello, I'm Ruth from France.
שלום, אני ערן ספילר, מישראל.
Bonjour, I'm Olivier from
Hi, I'm Gilbert Villiers of Gold Coast, Australia.